Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. The aroma of sautéing onions and garlic, the rich scent of tomato and basil simmering on the stove. That was my world on that particular Tuesday afternoon. Just a regular Tuesday, or so I thought. The sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, catching the steam rising from the pasta pot, making everything look a bit hazy and golden. I was humming a little tune, something a bit bluesy I'd heard on the radio earlier, feeling that quiet contentment that comes from a simple, productive day. George, my husband, was at his weekly golf game, a ritual as predictable as the sunrise. He wouldn't be home for another couple of hours, which meant I had the house and my thoughts all to myself. I was making his favorite lasagna. It's a bit of a production, but I find the process soothing, layering the noodles, the rich meat sauce, the creamy ricotta mixture. Each step a meditation. The doorbell chimed, clear and a little sharp, cutting through my peaceful kitchen symphony. I wasn't expecting anyone. My first thought was maybe it was one of those door-to-door salesmen, though they were rare these days. I wiped my hands on my apron, a faded floral one that had seen better days but felt like an old friend, and headed to the front door. Peeking through the peephole, I was surprised to see Arthur standing on the porch. Arthur Jensen, George's best friend since college. Now, Arthur wasn't exactly a stranger, but he wasn't a casual drop-by sort of person either. He was always polite, always kind, but there was a certain reserve about him, a quiet formality that made his unannounced presence all the more curious. He looked a little, rumpled. Not his usual neat self. His hair, usually perfectly combed, was slightly askew, and his tie was loosened at the collar of his shirt. He held a worn leather briefcase in one hand, clutching it like a lifeline. "Arthur," I said, opening the door, trying to keep the surprise out of my voice. "What a surprise. Is everything all right?" He offered a smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. They looked tired, shadowed. "Martha, hello. I hope I'm not intruding. I know George isn't here. He mentioned golf today." "Not at all. Come in," I said, stepping back to let him pass. "I'm just in the kitchen, wrestling with a lasagna." He stepped inside, and the familiar, faint scent of his subtle, woodsy cologne mixed with the aroma of my cooking. It was a scent I associated with their poker nights, with serious conversations in George's study. "Lasagna, huh? Smells wonderful. George is a lucky man." "He certainly thinks so when it comes to this lasagna," I chuckled, trying to lighten the atmosphere. There was an undeniable tension emanating from him, a quiet hum of unease that was quite unlike the Arthur I knew. "Can I get you something? Water? Coffee? I think there's some iced tea." "Water would be great. Thank you, Martha," he said, following me towards the kitchen. He placed his briefcase carefully on the floor beside one of the kitchen chairs, as if it contained state secrets, before seating himself at the small oak table we used for breakfast. I poured him a tall glass of iced water, adding a slice of lemon. As I handed it to him, our fingers brushed for a fleeting second. It was nothing, a tiny, inconsequential contact, yet I felt a strange little jolt, like a flicker of static electricity. His hand was cool. He took a long sip of the water, his gaze distant, fixed on something beyond the kitchen wall. The silence stretched for a moment, filled only by the gentle bubble of the sauce on the stove. I turned the heat down a notch, stalling, unsure what to say next. It was clear this wasn't just a social call. "So," I began gently, leaning against the counter, "what brings you by this way, Arthur? Is it something about George?" A little worry started to creep in. Golf courses, men of a certain age. You hear stories. He shook his head quickly. "Oh no, George is fine. As far as I know, he's probably cursing his sand wedge on the 7th hole right about now." He attempted another smile, a little more successful this time, but the shadows in his eyes remained. "No, it's not about George. Not directly, anyway." He paused, turning the glass in his hands, watching the condensation trail down the side. I was in the neighborhood. I had a meeting nearby that ended early, and I found myself driving around." He looked up at me, a hint of vulnerability in his expression that I'd never seen before. "To be honest, Martha, I think I just needed to not be alone for a bit. And your house was, well, it felt like a safe port in a storm, I suppose." A safe port in a storm. That was quite a thing for Arthur to say. He was always the stoic one, the unflappable friend George leaned on. To see him like this, admitting a need for sanctuary, it caught me off guard. The kitchen, with its warm, savory smells and the gentle rhythm of my cooking, suddenly felt like more than just a room in a house. It felt like the very place he needed to be. And I, apparently, was the person he'd sought out. The subtle tension I'd felt earlier didn't disappear, but it began to morph into something else, a sense of anticipation, a feeling that the ordinary skin of the day was about to be peeled back to reveal something unexpected underneath. I took a deep breath, the scent of basil and oregano filling my lungs, and knew with a sudden certainty that this Tuesday was no longer going to be just ordinary. I found myself pulling up a chair opposite him, my lasagna momentarily forgotten. "Arthur," I said, my voice softer now, "you can always find a safe port here. What's going on?" He looked at me, really looked at me then, and it felt as if a carefully constructed wall around him had begun to show its first cracks. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, as if searching for the right words, or perhaps the courage to voice them. The afternoon sun shifted, casting longer shadows across the kitchen floor, and the only sound was the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the gentle tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall, each tick measuring out a moment that felt increasingly significant. I waited, giving him the space he clearly needed, a sense of profound sympathy welling up inside me for this man I'd known for years, yet suddenly felt I was seeing for the very first time. The air was thick with unspoken words, with a vulnerability that was both fragile and incredibly brave. And I knew, instinctively, that I needed to listen. Really listen. He finally sighed, a deep, weary sound that seemed to come from the very core of him. It's my daughter, Emily," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, and just like that, the story started to unfold, an unexpected turn on a day that had begun with the simple promise of a home-cooked meal. The kitchen, my sanctuary, was about to become his. I leaned forward, my hands resting on the worn wood of the table. "Emily? What's happened with Emily? Is she all right?" I knew Emily, of course. A bright, spirited young woman, just out of college, full of dreams. Arthur adored her. It was plain to see whenever he spoke of her. Arthur stared down at his hands, which were clasped tightly on the table. "Physically, yes, she's fine. But Martha, she's made some choices, some decisions. And I don't know how to handle it. I feel like I'm failing her, or maybe I've already failed her." His voice was raw, laced with a pain that was palpable. It was the sound of a father's heart breaking, and it resonated deeply within me. I thought of my own children, grown and flown, and the worries that never quite faded, no matter how old they got. "Oh, Arthur," I said softly, tell me what's going on." I reached across the table and gently placed my hand over his. It was a simple gesture, meant to offer comfort, a bit of human connection in his moment of distress. He didn't pull away. Instead, his fingers tightened slightly under mine, a silent acknowledgement of the offer of support. He took another shaky breath. She's involved with someone. Someone much older. Someone who, well, let's just say his reputation isn't sterling. And she's so headstrong, so convinced she's in love. She won't listen to reason, not from me, not from her mother. He looked up, his eyes pleading. She's always been such a sensible girl, Martha. Smart, grounded. And now, it's like she's a different person. He's got her wrapped around his little finger, and I'm terrified he's going to hurt her, or worse, ruin her future. The story tumbled out of him then, a torrent of anxieties, frustrations, and fears. He spoke of sleepless nights, of arguments with his wife, Carol, who was beside herself with worry. He talked about Emily's increasing distance, her defensiveness, the way she shut him out whenever he tried to broach the subject. He wasn't just worried. He was heartbroken, confused, and feeling utterly powerless. The Arthur I was seeing now was a far cry from the composed, almost detached man I usually encountered at social gatherings. This was a father laid bare, his love for his child making him vulnerable and exposed. I listened, truly listened, without interrupting, letting him pour it all out. My lasagna, the symbol of my quiet afternoon, was now the furthest thing from my mind. The kitchen had transformed from a place of solitary comfort into a shared space of earnest confidence. The golden afternoon light seemed to deepen, creating an atmosphere of intimacy and trust. He wasn't just George's friend anymore. He was Arthur, a man in pain, reaching out. And I, Martha, was no longer just George's wife, pottering in the kitchen. I was a friend, a confidant, someone who understood, at least in part, the turbulent waters of parenthood. When he finally paused, his shoulders slumped, the story told, a heavy silence settled in the room. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, but one filled with the weight of his confession. I squeezed his hand gently before withdrawing mine. Arthur, I began, choosing my words carefully. I can only imagine how painful this must be. When our children choose paths we wouldn't choose for them, paths we fear will lead to harm. It's one of the hardest things a parent can go through. I thought of a time when my own son, Michael, had worried us sick with a rebellious streak in his late teens. The helplessness, the fear. It was a familiar ache. It is, he whispered, his gaze still downcast. It truly is. I feel like I should be able to do something, to fix it. But everything I try just seems to push her further away. Sometimes, I said softly, the more we push, the harder they resist, especially when they feel like they're defending their own judgment, their own heart. I remembered that from my own experiences. Sometimes all you could do was keep the lines of communication open, however frayed they might become, and let them know you were there. He looked up at me then, a flicker of something, surprise, gratitude, in his tired eyes. You understand, he said, not as a question, but as a statement. I do, I affirmed. Not Emily's exact situation, of course, but the feeling of watching your child, someone you love more than life itself, head towards what you can only see as a cliff edge. It's terrifying. He nodded slowly, a sigh escaping him. Carol is. She's taking it very hard. Lots of tears, lots of anger towards Emily, towards this man. And I tried to be the calm one, the rational one. But inside, Martha, inside I'm just as torn up. Maybe more so, because I feel I have to be strong for Carol. Ah, the burden of perceived strength. How often had George felt that? How often had I? It was another layer to his distress, the need to maintain a facade for his wife while his own emotions were in turmoil. "You don't have to be strong all the time, Arthur," I said gently. "Not with everyone. Sometimes it's okay to admit that you're struggling, that you're scared." I paused, then added, "That's what friends are for, isn't it? And you and George, you're more like brothers." A faint, sad smile touched his lips. "He's a good man, George. I haven't even told him the half of this. I didn't want to burden him. He's got his own pressures at work. He'd want to know, Arthur. He'd want to be there for you, just like you've always been there for him. I knew my husband. Loyalty was his bedrock." The conversation flowed on, not in a rush anymore, but in a gentler current. We talked about Emily, about the complexities of young adulthood, the allure of unsuitable partners, the difficulty of letting children make their own mistakes, even potentially painful ones. I didn't offer easy solutions because there weren't any. Instead, I shared some of my own experiences with my kids, the times I'd felt lost or helpless, the small victories and the lingering worries. It wasn't about giving advice so much as it was about creating a space where he didn't feel so alone in his anguish. The afternoon light began to fade, the golden hour giving way to the softer hues of early evening. The lasagna was definitely on the back burner, figuratively and literally. What was cooking now was something far more intricate, a shared understanding, a moment of unexpected human connection that felt both precious and profound. Arthur, who had walked in looking like a man carrying the weight of the world, seemed a little lighter. The lines of tension around his eyes had softened, and though the worry was still there, it was now mingled with a sense of having been heard, truly heard. He eventually looked at the clock on the stove. "Goodness, Martha, I've taken up your whole afternoon. Your lasagna." I smiled. "The lasagna can wait. Some things are more important." I stood up and went to the stove, checking the sauce. It was still fine, just needed a stir. "Besides," I added, looking back at him, "it sounds like you needed to talk more than George needs his dinner on time tonight." He chuckled, a genuine sound this time, and it warmed the kitchen more than the stuff-it-off ever could. "You have no idea, Martha. Thank you. Really. I feel a bit more human again." "That's what happens when we share our burdens, Arthur," I said. "They don't necessarily disappear, but they feel a little less heavy." I picked up his empty water glass. "Another one? Or maybe something stronger? George keeps some decent brandy for medicinal purposes, of course." He smiled, a tired but grateful smile. "Just water for now, thanks. I should probably think about heading home soon. Face the music with Carol. But maybe I'll approach it a little differently tonight. Thanks to you." I refilled his glass, and as I placed it back on the table, I felt a quiet sense of something. It wasn't triumph or pride. It was more like a gentle awareness of the unseen threads that connect us, the unexpected ways we can touch each other's lives, even in the midst of a mundane Tuesday afternoon. My kitchen, my ordinary kitchen, had become a confessional, a sanctuary, a place of quiet healing. And as Arthur prepared to leave, I knew that this conversation, this unexpected sharing, had changed something, not just for him, but for me too. It had reminded me of the power of listening, the strength in vulnerability, and the quiet grace of simply being present for another human being. The lasagna could indeed wait. Some feasts are of the heart. As Arthur finally stood up to leave, a sense of calm seemed to have settled over him, a stark contrast to the agitated man who had arrived a couple of hours earlier. He picked up his briefcase, which no longer seemed like such a heavy burden. "Martha," he said, his voice imbued with a sincerity that touched me deeply, "I don't know how to thank you. You've been incredibly kind. More than kind. Arthur, there's no need for thanks, I replied, walking with him to the door. That's what friends do, or at least what they should do. I paused, then added, and please don't be a stranger, especially when things are tough. My door and my ears are always open. And tell George. He'll want to help, you know that. He nodded, a genuine smile lighting his face this time. I will. I promise. And you're right, I should talk to him more openly about it. He's a good friend. He stepped out onto the porch, the evening air cool and fresh around us. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. It was a beautiful end to a day that had taken such an unexpected turn. Take care, Arthur, I said softly. And remember, Emily is young. People can and do find their way. Sometimes they just need to know the door home is always open, no judgment attached. He looked at me for a long moment, his gaze thoughtful. You've given me a lot to think about, Martha. A different perspective. Thank you. With a final nod, he turned and walked towards his car, his steps seeming a little less burdened than when he'd arrived. I watched him go, a quiet sense of peace settling over me. Closing the door, I leaned against it for a moment, the lingering scent of Arthur's cologne, now a reminder of the intimate conversation that had filled my kitchen. The house felt quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was a quiet filled with reflection, with a renewed appreciation for the complexities of human connection. I walked back to the kitchen, the aroma of the cooling lasagna sauce now mingling with the memory of shared confidences. The earlier contentment I'd felt while cooking returned, but it was deeper now, enriched by the afternoon's events. I looked around my kitchen. The familiar counters, the waiting ingredients for the lasagna, the chairs where Arthur and I had sat. It was just a kitchen, yes, but it had also been a haven. It struck me then how life has this incredible way of surprising you. You think you're just making dinner, lost in the mundane rhythm of your day, and then suddenly you find yourself in the middle of something profoundly human, something that touches your soul and reminds you of what truly matters. It wasn't about a dramatic event, no earth-shattering revelation in the traditional sense. What happened was subtle, quiet, yet incredibly powerful. It was about two people connecting on a level that transcended the everyday. It was about the shedding of stoic facades and the courageous embrace of vulnerability. For Arthur, it was a moment of unburdening, of finding an unexpected ally. For me, it was a reaffirmation of empathy, a reminder of the quiet strength found in listening and offering solace without judgment. I realized I hadn't felt this. Engaged, perhaps, in a long time. My life with George was comfortable, steady. We loved each other, of course. But years of routine can sometimes dull the edges of emotional intimacy, not just with your spouse, but with the world around you. Arthur's visit, his raw honesty, had somehow pierced through that. It made me think about my own relationships, my conversations, the way I listened, or perhaps, sometimes, didn't listen enough. As I finally turned my attention back to the lasagna, layering the noodles and sauce and cheese, my earlier humming returned, but the melody felt different. It was more thoughtful, tinged with a gentle melancholy, but also with a sense underscore of warmth. The experience hadn't been dramatic in a flashy way, no shocking twists or turns that you might see in a movie. But it was deeply, unexpectedly emotional. It was real. When George came home later that evening, full of stories about his golf game, his missed putts, and one surprisingly good drive, I listened with a new attentiveness. He noticed the lasagna, his favorite, and his face lit up. "Smells incredible, Marty," he said, giving me a hug. "You're the best." Arthur dropped by earlier, I said casually as we sat down to eat. George looked surprised. Oh, what did he want? Everything okay with him? He's going through a tough time with Emily, I explained, sharing a toned-down version of what Arthur had told me, respecting his confidence, but also knowing George would want to reach out. He needed someone to talk to. George's expression softened with concern. Poor guy. Emily's a good kid. I should give him a call tomorrow. He looked at me, a flicker of appreciation in his eyes. Good thing he came here. You're a good listener, Marty. I smiled. Sometimes that's all people need. Later that night, as I lay in bed, the house quiet around me, I thought about Arthur and Emily, about Carol, and about the unseen struggles people carry with them. I thought about the unexpected gift of that afternoon, the chance to offer comfort, yes, but also the chance to feel so deeply connected to another person's experience. It was a reminder that life's most meaningful moments often arrive unannounced, not in grand gestures, but in the quiet spaces of shared humanity, sometimes over nothing more than a glass of water in a sunlit kitchen, while the lasagna waits. I realized that I had grown a little that afternoon. My own emotional landscape subtly shifted, enriched by the unexpected detour from my ordinary day. And I wouldn't have traded that for the most perfectly timed lasagna in the world.